If you followed tutorials carefully and your photos still don't look like what you were promised, the problem usually isn't that you missed a step. It's that tutorials rarely show you everything that matters, especially the parts that can't be packaged neatly. This isn't about doing tutorials better. It's about understanding what tutorials leave out. So you stop blaming yourself for something that was never fully explained. One of the most discouraging experiences in photography is doing everything right and still not getting the result you expected. You watched the tutorial, you followed the steps, you copied the settings, and when you look at your photo, it doesn't resemble what you were shown. Not even close. At first, most people assume they made a mistake. They retrace their steps. They double-check settings. They replay the video. Did I miss something? Did I misunderstand this part? Did I do it wrong? That's where doubt begins. Because when the promised result doesn't appear, the only variable left seems to be you. But this is where the real problem starts. Tutorials are demonstrations, not diagnoses. They show what worked for one person in one situation under a specific set of conditions. They rarely show the context that made the result possible. And that missing context is where learning quietly breaks down. Most tutorials are designed to be clean. They remove friction, they simplify steps, they streamline decisions. That makes them watchable. But it also makes them incomplete. When someone records a tutorial, they are usually working from years of embodied experience. Their hands know where to go without thinking. Their eye already knows what to look for. Their decisions happen quickly and mostly unconsciously. Those things don't show up on screen, but they matter more than the steps being explained. When a beginner watches that tutorial, they're trying to reproduce visible actions without access to the invisible skills underneath them. That creates an expectation gap. The expectation becomes, if I follow these steps, I should get that result. The reality is, these steps only work inside a larger framework I don't have yet. No one tells beginners that part, so when results don't match expectations, confidence takes the hit. I hear this all the time from students. I watched so many tutorials and none of it worked. I don't understand why my photos never look like that. I must be missing something obvious. They're not missing intelligence. They're missing context. Tutorials often assume foundational skills that beginners haven't had time to build yet. Things like recognizing light instinctively, adjusting settings without breaking focus, knowing when conditions don't match the example, understanding when to adapt instead of copy. Those skills don't come from watching. They come from repetition, from trial, from adjustment, from time spent noticing. Tutorials rarely slow down to teach that part. Not because creators are doing something wrong, but because repetition is not exciting content. Another issue is that tutorials usually isolate one variable. This video is about aperture. This one is about posing. This one is about editing. But photography doesn't happen one variable at a time. Light is changing, subjects are moving, you're repositioning, your timing matters. So, when a tutorial removes that complexity, it creates a false sense of control. It looks simpler than it is. That's not deceptive, it's structural, but the effect is real. Beginners start to believe photography should feel straightforward, and when it doesn't, they assume they're failing. Another thing tutorials rarely show is failure. You don't see the missed frames, the awkward attempts, the moments where something didn't work and had to be adjusted. You see smooth execution. That absence matters because beginners assume smooth execution is normal. They don't realize what they're watching is a highlight reel built on experience. Another quiet problem is that tutorials flatten learning timelines. They make progress look immediate. Watch, apply, succeed. But real learning is slower. It includes inconsistent results, photos that almost work, sessions that feel confusing. Tutorials don't show the almost, they show the finished version. And when reality doesn't match that story, discouragement sets in. Another issue is that tutorials often focus on outcomes instead of decision making. They tell you what to do. They don't always explain why that choice made sense in that moment. So beginners learn steps without learning how to adapt them. When conditions change, and they always do, the steps fall apart. That's not a lack of effort, it's a lack of transfer. Knowledge didn't transfer because the reasoning wasn't taught. Another subtle problem is that tutorials collapse multiple skills into one lesson. A portrait tutorial might quietly require camera comfort, light awareness, subject direction, timing, composition, and editing judgment. But it's presented as if you're learning one thing. That creates unrealistic expectations. People think they're bad at posing when the issue is timing. They think they're bad at editing when exposure wasn't stable. Without understanding how skills layer, everything feels confusing. Another thing I see often is people bouncing between tutorials trying to fix the issue. One video doesn't work, so they watch another and another. Each one adds information, but information without integration increases overwhelm. Eventually, people stop trusting tutorials, or worse, they stop trusting themselves. They assume they're the problem. That's the most damaging outcome, because photography learning should build confidence, not erode it. Another important factor is that tutorials are often recorded in controlled environments, controlled light, predictable conditions, cooperative subjects. Beginners are usually practicing in uncontrolled environments. Mixed light, limited time, unpredictable situations. Copying results across those gaps is extremely difficult. But tutorials rarely acknowledge that difference explicitly, so beginners internalize the gap as personal failure. Another thing tutorials rarely show is decision prioritization. Experienced photographers know what to ignore. Beginners don't. Tutorials often add more things to think about instead of fewer. That increases cognitive load, and high cognitive load reduces performance. You might technically know what to do, but you can't execute under pressure. That's not incompetence. That's overload. Another quiet effect of tutorial culture is that it teaches people to look outward for answers, instead of asking, what did I notice? What changed? What can I adjust? They ask, what video should I watch next? That keeps learning external. But photography skill grows internally, through observation, through experimentation, through reflection. Tutorials can support that process, but they can't replace it. Another thing tutorials don't account for is emotional context. They don't talk about nerves, or hesitation, or self-consciousness, but those things affect photos. If you're tense, your timing changes, your framing tightens, your willingness to experiment drops. Tutorials don't show that, but learners experience it, and when they don't see it reflected, they assume they're uniquely struggling. They're not. They're human. So when someone says, my photos don't look like the tutorials, what they're really saying is, I did what I was told, and I still don't understand what I'm missing. Most of the time, what's missing isn't another step. It's timing, foundations, context, and permission to be where they are. Tutorials aren't useless, but they're incomplete. They're one tool, not a full learning system. And when people rely on them without understanding their limits, frustration builds. That frustration is not a sign photography isn't for you. It's a sign the learning structure didn't support you. That distinction matters. Because once you stop blaming yourself, learning becomes possible again. At this point, it's important to say something clearly. Tutorials are not the enemy. They're not useless. They're not a scam. They're not a sign that photography education is broken. They just aren't meant to do what many people expect them to do. Most frustration around tutorials comes from using them for the wrong job. Tutorials are demonstrations. They show possibilities. They show workflows. They show what a result can look like. They are not meant to build foundations on their own. And when they're treated like foundations, confusion follows. One of the most helpful reframes is this: tutorials are examples, not instructions. They show a way, not the way. Once you understand that, they become far less discouraging. Most tutorials assume you already have a baseline level of comfort with your camera. They assume you can change settings without breaking your concentration. They assume you can recognize when light is shifting. They assume you can tell when something isn't working and adapt. Those assumptions aren't stated, but they're there. That's why tutorials often feel like they skip steps. They don't skip steps intentionally, they skip invisible skills. Invisible skills are the hardest part of photography to teach. They're things like noticing before adjusting, recognizing patterns, sensing when something is off, knowing which problem matters most in a moment. Those skills aren't procedural, they're experiential, and tutorials struggle to convey experience. Another important thing tutorials do well is introduce vocabulary. They give you names for things: aperture, depth of field, backlighting, Rembrandt lighting. That vocabulary matters. It helps you think about photography. But knowing the names of things is not the same as knowing how to use them. This is where many learners get stuck. They understand the words, they've watched the videos, but their hands and eyes haven't caught up yet. That gap feels uncomfortable. And without reassurance, people assume it means they're behind. Another thing tutorials are good at is showing finished decision paths. They show what choices were made. They rarely show how many options were considered and dismissed. That makes the process look cleaner than it actually is. Experienced photographers don't arrive at settings instantly. They arrive quickly because they've practiced the same decisions many times. That speed is earned, not assumed. Another limitation of tutorials is that they often isolate variables. A video about aperture treats aperture as if it exists alone. But in real shooting, aperture interacts with shutter speed, ISO, subject movement, and light quality. Beginners don't yet know how to juggle those interactions. So when they try to apply a single variable lesson in a multi-variable environment, things fall apart. That's not because the lesson was wrong. It's because the system wasn't ready. Another important limitation is that tutorials rarely teach prioritization. They give you information. They don't always tell you what matters most right now. Beginners need help knowing what to ignore. Tutorials often add to the mental load instead of reducing it. That creates decision fatigue. Decision fatigue makes execution harder, even when the knowledge is technically there. Another thing tutorials struggle with is timing. Not video timing, learning timing. A tutorial might be technically accurate, but poorly timed for where you are in your learning. Learning something too early can be just as confusing as learning it too late. When people say, "I tried this and it didn't work," often what they mean is, "I wasn't ready to use this yet." Tutorials don't know where you are. They can't adapt to your stage. That's not a failure. It's a limitation of the format. Another issue is that tutorials often compress time. They show results quickly. They don't show repetition. They don't show the hours or days of practice behind the clip. So learners expect fast results. And when those results don't come, frustration builds. Photography doesn't reward speed early. It rewards consistency. Tutorials don't always communicate that. Another problem is that tutorials often focus on outcomes instead of processes. They show you the what. They don't always walk through the how or the why in enough depth. That makes transfer difficult. Transfer is the ability to apply a concept in a new situation. Without understanding the reasoning behind a choice, transfer doesn't happen. You can copy, but you can't adapt. Another subtle issue is that tutorials often stack too many goals. You're learning exposure and composition and posing and editing all at once. That's overwhelming. Your brain can only focus on so many things at a time. When tutorials demand more than your working memory can hold, learning slows. That's not a personal limitation. It's a cognitive one. Another thing tutorials don't account for is emotional load. When you're nervous, excited, or self-conscious, your ability to process information drops. That's normal. Tutorials assume neutral emotional states. Real shooting rarely happens in neutral emotional states. That mismatch affects outcomes. Another issue is that tutorials don't teach recovery. They don't show what to do when something goes wrong. They don't show how to troubleshoot in real time. Beginners often freeze when conditions don't match the example. They don't know which lever to pull. That freezing is not incompetence. It's lack of prioritization experience. So how should tutorials be used? They work best as references, as examples, as reinforcement after practice, not as primary teachers. The most effective way to use tutorials is after you've already struggled with something. When you've tried, noticed, failed a little, then watched. That order matters. Experience first, explanation second. That sequence allows the tutorial to land. Another effective way to use tutorials is selectively. Not binging, not collecting, but choosing one idea to explore, then practicing it intentionally. Tutorials become useful when they support a focused learning goal, not when they introduce new goals constantly. Another important shift is to stop expecting tutorials to produce results. Their job is to provide input. Your job is to integrate that input through practice. That integration takes time. Another helpful mindset is to treat tutorials as conversations, not commandments. They're suggestions. You can try them, you can adapt them, you can discard them. They don't define your worth or progress. Another thing that helps is recognizing when tutorials are adding confusion instead of clarity. That's a signal to pause, not to consume more. Sometimes the best learning move is to stop watching and start noticing. Another important point is that tutorials are not a substitute for foundations. They sit on top of foundations. When foundations are shaky, tutorials feel unstable. That's not because tutorials are bad, it's because they're advanced relative to where you are. Another thing to understand is that tutorials often assume repetition has already happened. They show the refined version, not the messy learning stage. That's why beginners feel like they're missing something. They are. They're missing time. Time can't be sped up by watching more videos. It can only be accumulated through practice. Another subtle effect of tutorial culture is that it can create dependency. People feel like they can't shoot without guidance. They hesitate to trust their instincts. That hesitation slows growth. Photography requires decision-making. Tutorials can inform decisions. They can't replace them. Another important shift is to recognize that tutorials work best when paired with constraints. Limit how many you watch. Limit how often you watch. Give yourself time to integrate. Without integration, information piles up, and piled information feels like failure. Another helpful approach is to ask different questions while watching tutorials. Instead of, what settings did they use? Ask, what problem were they solving? What did they notice first? What did they ignore? Those questions build transfer. Another important idea is that tutorials are snapshots. They capture a moment. Your photography is a process. Don't compare a snapshot to a process. That comparison is unfair. Another thing to keep in mind is that tutorials often represent best-case scenarios. Best light, best timing, best cooperation. Your work happens in average conditions. That doesn't mean it's worse, it means it's real. Another point is that tutorials don't account for your preferences. Your comfort, your pace, your environment. Photography is personal. Tutorials are general. That mismatch matters. Another thing that helps is to use tutorials as post-session reflection. After shooting, ask, would a tutorial help me understand this better now? That timing increases usefulness. Another important distinction is that tutorials teach technique. They don't teach judgment. Judgment comes from experience. Knowing when not to apply a technique is just as important as knowing how. Tutorials don't cover that. Another helpful shift is to stop measuring success by similarity. Your photo doesn't need to look like the tutorial to be successful, it needs to be intentional. Learning is not mimicry, it's adaptation. Another thing tutorials don't show is how long it takes for concepts to feel natural. They show results, not fluency. Fluency takes repetition. Another important reminder is that confusion is not a sign you're failing. It's a sign you're learning something complex. Photography is complex. Simplified explanations don't remove that complexity. They just postpone it. Another thing to keep in mind is that tutorials are not neutral. They reflect the creator's preferences, their style, their environment, their priorities. That doesn't make them wrong, but it means they're not universal. Another helpful reframe is to treat tutorials as inspiration, not instruction. Let them spark curiosity, not dictate behavior. Another thing that helps is to build confidence through small wins. Tutorials often aim for big results. Big results take time. Small improvements matter more early on. Another important shift is to give yourself permission to stop mid-tutorial. If something doesn't apply, you don't have to finish. You don't owe it anything. Your learning is yours. Another thing that reduces frustration is to pair tutorials with reflection. After watching, ask, what one thing can I try next time? One thing, not 10. That reduces overload. Another important idea is that tutorials can't teach awareness. They can only point toward it. Awareness develops through practice. Another helpful reminder is that tutorials are optional. You can learn without them. They're a tool, not a requirement. Another thing that helps is to recognize when watching becomes avoidance. Sometimes people watch tutorials instead of practicing because practice feels vulnerable. That's understandable. But growth happens in the doing. Another important shift is to stop treating tutorials as proof of progress. Watching feels productive, but practice is where learning sticks. Another thing to keep in mind is that confusion often resolves itself with time. Things click later, not immediately. That delay is normal. Another helpful perspective is to view tutorials as part of a larger ecosystem. They're one input among many. They don't replace experience, they supplement it. Another thing that reduces frustration is to set boundaries around consumption. Decide how much you'll watch, then stop. That protects energy. Another important idea is that tutorials don't teach patience, but photography requires it. Patience is learned through experience. Another final point in this section is this. If tutorials have made you feel inadequate, that's not a personal failing. It's a mismatch between what tutorials are designed to do and what you needed them to do. Once you understand that, you can use them without letting them undermine your confidence. And confidence is what allows learning to continue. By the time people reach this stage in photography, the problem usually isn't lack of information. It's lack of trust. Not trust in photography. Trust in themselves. They've watched enough tutorials to know what's possible. They've seen enough examples to know what good can look like. But somewhere along the way, the gap between effort and outcome started to feel personal. And that's when people quietly begin to disengage. Not all at once. Gradually, they shoot less, they hesitate more, they second-guess decisions they used to make easily, they stop experimenting, they tell themselves they'll come back later when they know more. That pause feels reasonable, but often it stretches. And what gets lost in that stretch isn't skill, it's confidence. This is where many photographers decide they need to start over. They switch styles, they overhaul their workflow, they look for a new tutorial series, they assume the issue is the path they chose. But most of the time, the issue isn't the path. It's the pressure they put on themselves while walking it. Starting over feels productive, it feels decisive, but it often recreates the same problem in a new form. The same expectations, the same overload, the same disappointment. What actually helps at this stage is not restarting. It's stabilizing. Stabilizing how you learn, stabilizing what you expect from yourself, stabilizing your relationship with photography. That begins by rebuilding trust. Trust that confusion is part of learning. Trust that inconsistency doesn't mean regression. Trust that skill develops unevenly. One of the most damaging beliefs tutorial culture creates is the idea that understanding should be immediate, that if something hasn't clicked yet, you've failed. That belief makes people impatient with themselves. Impatience erodes curiosity. Curiosity is essential for growth. Another thing that undermines trust is constant comparison. Tutorials make comparison easy. You see polished results without seeing the process behind them. Your work looks messy by comparison, but messiness is not failure. It's transition. Another thing that happens is people stop trusting their own observations. They defer to what they've seen online instead of what they notice in front of them. They stop asking, "What's happening here?" and start asking, "What would someone else do?" That shift slows learning. Photography requires decision-making. Decision-making requires trust. Another thing that erodes trust is expecting consistency too early. Beginners often think inconsistency means something is wrong, but inconsistency is a sign that multiple skills are developing at different speeds. That's normal. Consistency comes later, after repetition, after adjustment. Another important shift is narrowing focus. Trying to fix everything at once overwhelms the system. Choosing one thing to pay attention to restores confidence. Small focus creates small wins. Small wins accumulate. Another helpful reframe is separating learning from performance. You don't need your photos to be impressive while you're learning. Learning can be messy. Performance comes later. Another thing that helps is slowing consumption. Watching fewer tutorials, practicing more, giving your brain time to integrate. Learning sticks when there's space. Another important idea is that photography skill lives in your nervous system, not just your intellect. It needs repetition, not explanation. Another thing that helps is allowing yourself to be a beginner longer, not rushing identity, not demanding mastery. Photography is a long practice. There's no prize for finishing early. Another thing that helps is staying, not restarting. Staying with what you've already begun. Staying allows learning to compound. Starting over resets it. Another important point is that tutorials are not the problem. They just aren't meant to carry the entire learning process. Once you understand that, you can use them without letting them undermine your confidence. Now pause here. If your photos haven't looked like the tutorials yet, that doesn't mean you're behind. It usually means you're learning without enough context or sequence, and that's fixable. You don't need to start over. You need a structure that supports where you are now. Final closing, script 3, tightened. If learning photography has felt discouraging, it's not because you've failed. It's usually because tutorials were asked to do more than they're designed to do. On my website, I share a calm learning framework that helps photographers build foundations without pressure or overwhelm. It's there as a reference whenever learning starts to feel frustrating. You don't need to reset everything. You just need support that matches the stage you're in.